Good morning. This is Liz Granberg Jerome from Gypsy Dreamer Quilts, and this morning I'm going to talk to you about setting a seam guide, a dimensional guide to help keep a even seam allowance as you're sewing your pieces together and chain piecing for your quilts. I use a product called Dr. Scholl's Molefoam Padding. It's the thick stuff, and it comes in the foot care department. It's not your usual sewing tool, but for me it works. This is different from moleskin, which is very thin. This is very dimensional and will give you a dimensional seam allowance. I also use a little seam guide, and this is one that I had made for myself with Gypsy Dreamer quilts on it, that has a little hole drilled at a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch line on it, and this lines up with the needle through the hole and will be under the foot, and then you will set a piece of the mole foam, which you can see is pretty thick, next to it, and when it sticks to your machine, that becomes your seam guide. There are other guides out there. This one was a freebie on a shop hop. It was from one of the quilt shops, also drilled. This one has a drill at a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, and 5/8, so it's a little more versatile for different projects. And there's also another one that you'll often see, a little small one, and again, this one's drilled at a 1/4, 3/8, a 1/2, 5/8, and 3/4. I like a little bit longer length, so mine is actually 1 inch longer than the little one that I started with, and the longest one is one that my husband found, actually came from a shop when he was out on a shop hop. So there's different ones out there to pick from. This one here is available for sale from me. It's $5, and if you want one, you can let me know. This is not on my Etsy. It's something I had been reserving for workshops, which we haven't done for over a year. Okay. When you're working with a modern machine like this, I use my needle to adjust. If I'm working on a stationary, on a non-zigzag like my Featherweight, then I just use the ruler and I don't have to adjust where the needle goes because it doesn't move. On this one, if you'll notice, I've got a sticky note up here that says width 6, length 2.0. 6 is the adjustment on my needle, and it's the zigzag adjustment that I can move my needle over to. And I'm going to pause here and show you what that looks like. Okay, this is the little control screen on my machine. This is a bigger machine than some of you may have. But what I'm looking for is down here at the bottom, and I'm going to try and zoom in here and get it down to where you can see. On a zigzag machine, you can move your needle to different positions. It's not adding a zigzag to it, it's just adjusting the needle where it goes. This one will actually go up to 7.0. 7 millimeters is as wide as my zigzag is. 7 is a little bit too scant for what I want. A 6 is what I prefer, and when I'm piecing, I always bring my stitch length down to 2.0 and sometimes down to 1.8. Shorter stitches will keep your pieces from coming apart at the ends. A shorter stitch is less likely to open back up, whereas the standard 2.5, you could lose some of your stitches since we don't backstitch in quilting. Okay, so I've moved my stitch over, or my needle over, and I'm going to come over and I'm going to drop my needle through that hole. And don't feel bad if you don't get it on the first shot, because most of us don't. If you notice, The foot isn't as wide as the zigzag opening for the feed dogs. I'm moving the needle over and lining the edge of this little seam guide up with the edge of the feed dogs. When you're working with a zigzag machine, you can't cover the feed dogs with a seam guide. It'll feed them right through and be a problem. So I move the needle over to where my 1/4 inch with the needle in the hole is now even with the outside edge of the feed dogs. I've taken the little paper off the back of the Molefoam strip and I've stuck it down right next to that guide. I'm going to lift my needle back up and then pull the ruler away. And now when I piece, I'm going to have a consistent 1/4 inch seam. See if I can find a couple of pieces here. Always have triangles around. Then it might not match, but they work. And I would drop this down to where the needle is just at the beginning of where the fabric is, so that you're not gonna get the thread lost or knotted up. And then I can sew. And if I take another pair, see if we can find a piece to work with here. I can feed another one in right like this, and chain piece I can sew continuously. And then when I come out, but all of my seams are going to be very even. They're all going to be the same. And that's how I set up with my seam guide. Now when you're sewing and you want to make sure you've got a proper 1/4 inch, I would take 2 or 3 pieces that are the same width, like a 2.5 inch strip, sew them together with your 1/4 inch as you've got it marked, and when you're done, press them and then measure and make sure that if you've sewn pieces together and you know it's supposed to be 4.5 inches, if you sewed 2 2.5s together, that it measures 4.5. And an extra double check would be to sew 3 pieces together and double check 3 across, so that multiple seams going in will give you the proper dimension when you're complete. I hope this has been helpful. That's the sewing machine seam allowance guide, the 1/4 inch seam guide with Dr. Scholl's Molefoam Padding, a nice 3-dimensional guide.